Welcome back. I'm Austin Westfall. We've been watching images like this throughout the day as the BBC says that thousands of protesters returned to the streets of Georgia's capital city on Friday evening to protest against the government's decision to suspend accession talks with the European Union, quote, until the end of 2028. The news outlet saying that demonstrators were seen shouting traitors and holding photographs of journalists who they say were beaten by police overnight. National security analyst and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer is standing by. Hal, thanks for coming on. We've been watching these images and this protest activity. We were watching it yesterday here in the newsroom as well. What do we need to know about this? Why are these protesters so passionate about this?
Well, Austin, this has been building up over time. The Georgia Dream Party, which is the ruling party that is basically cozied up, largely tied to the Russians, has been pushing back on a number of initiatives. Of course, they recently passed a law anti-LGBTQ, which caused a lot of ire within the membership of the European Union. Georgia was on track, as much as you can say that, to eventually become a part of the European Union. There has always been hope that Georgia would at some point eventually become a NATO member as well. Part of Georgia, the northern part of Georgia, is actually occupied by Russian forces. And this goes back to when Russia was doing, 2008 through 2014, when they were expanding not just into Georgia, but they were doing a lot of activist stuff to include going into Crimea with its covert Little Green Men program and everything else. So this is part of a Russian-inspired movement, if you will, a Russian-backed movement there. Also, the opposition has said that the recent elections, where Georgia Dream won 54% of the votes in the legislature, that it was a rigged election, that it was illegal, and they've kind of alleged that they have proof of that as well. But what's interesting is that there's been a period of calm, quietude, if you will, within Georgia, certainly within the capital. And it was remarked upon that there had been active protests there, but it was kind of quiet. Then, of course, yesterday, it just completely turned around, and you have these massive protests. Of course, the government security forces have really cracked down, as you can see in this video here. A lot of very kinetic force, using, gassing protesters and taking them into custody and everything else. But the only reason, and this kind of gets into Georgia politics, one of the reasons that the Georgia Dream pro-Russian party has been able to stay in power is because the opposition is so fractured. And this has been remarked upon many times. If the opposition could ever come under one umbrella, kind of like the opposition did in Venezuela, that they maybe could turn this whole thing around. But right now, they're fighting because what they're seeing is this gradual encroachment of pro-Russian influence. They also see that this basically this change of policy on the EU is something that is very bad for Georgia, moving away from its certainly its democratic track, but also possibly hamstringing the Georgian economy. And the EU has been very generous. They've given over $500 million in grants over the last few years. So they've been doing a lot of things to prop up Georgia. But this is a big turnaround. And the European Union ambassador made that very clear. She said, this is a real setback.
We're looking at footage of fireworks going off in the streets. And what you're looking at here are, and it's a little bit of internet capability issues out in these areas. Oftentimes, that's why the video is buffering. But those are fireworks that are going off and lasers going into the sky. The BBC says, Hal, that more than 100 diplomats and civil servants in Georgia signed an open letter saying that the government's decision does not align with Georgia's strategic interests. You just alluded to this, but if you can expand. What are Georgia's strategic interests? They share a border with Russia, Hal. They're on the Black Sea as well.
Well, they share a border with a number of countries, but Georgia has always been kind of standing apart. In fact, that's one of the reasons that Russia went in there going back 15 years. That's one of the reasons that Russia went in and basically invaded Georgia and then pulled back its forces, but still occupy that northern portion of the country, is because they see this this Georgian independence, and I mean very independent movement, as a threat to Russian hegemony throughout the region. And they see a lot of countries looking to Georgia, particularly in South Asia, as an example of what they could become. They've also looking not too far away. Armenia has kind of moved away from the Russian orbit as well. So they're very concerned that the CTSO, the Russian ruled alternative, if you will, to NATO, is kind of crumbling and falling apart. And so part of that is to do what Putin loves to do, which is covert action, in this case, propping up a political party, trying to control the narrative within the country, rigging elections, you name it, to try and put his supporters into power. That's what he did successfully for a while in Ukraine. And then, of course, eventually Ukraine did break out of that orbit. And now you have the situation in Ukraine where Russia did a full-on invasion trying to crush the country. So this is part of the Russian program of trying to basically reconstitute, some would say the Soviet Union, but definitely trying to reconstitute under Putin something that looks more like the Russian Empire. And part of this, and that's what the Georgian people see right now, is that their independence, their strategic interests, if you will, as an independent country, are greatly eroded by this. And they see the European Union as really it's linked to the West, as it's linked to democracy, and honestly, it's linked to the global economy and its ability to be a separate nation state. So this hits on many different levels with the Georgian public, and that's what you're seeing on the streets.
Is it possible to tell whether the message of these protesters is a popular sentiment among the Georgian public? Is it possible this is a vocal minority? Is there any way to tell?
Yeah, that's a great question, Austin. And I would say if you look at the opposition across the board, and if you basically accept that the recent elections were rigged, it's clear that the majority of Georgians do not agree with the direction this is going. Now, as far as who's on the street, that's not the majority of Georgians, but these are very large crowds. These are large crowds that are going on the streets protesting, knowing that they're going to be actively targeted by government security forces and fairly draconian police tactics implored upon them, if you will, with all sorts of different things to try and take them into custody, to try and stop them from protesting, doing all sorts of things. So, there's a lot of bravery that we're seeing on the streets of Georgia right now. How long this will last, I can't tell you. We've seen other countries where they have massive protests on the street. Specifically, I'm thinking of Iran. And we're very hopeful that the last series of protests were going to do something, and they eventually were crushed and the protests stopped. And so we'll just have to see how this goes. One thing I would remind you of is if you want to go back 30 years ago, well, actually about 33 years ago, the Soviet Union was this omnipresent, huge empire that would never fall apart. And then it just fell apart very quickly. And whereas we were primarily focused on what was happening in the streets of Moscow and certainly the Berlin Wall falling apart, all over the Soviet Union, it fell apart very quickly. And these autocratic leaders were overthrown. The Soviet Union was kicked out of a number of countries very quickly. And with that, when things change in that part of the world, they tend to change at a very rapid pace. And what looks like it'll stay the same forever can literally disappear overnight. So I don't know where this will go. I don't know if they have enough gravitas to keep this going. But there certainly is a lot of popular support for what they're protesting.
Yeah, this bid has been suspended, at least for now, until 2028. Hal, a lot going on internationally. I want to talk Syria with you. We have to take a break real quick. If you will, let's stand by. We'll be right back.